Well, there we are. It's 2 o'clock this afternoon, and very warm welcome to those of you who've already managed to get into this afternoon's webinar on behaviour change. So this is the point at which we normally just allow a moment or two for participants to join us because some of them have challenges with the technology, but we're expecting a full house this afternoon. In fact, we have a maximum of 100 participants for this webinar, and we had 138 registrations. So if you do have any problems at any point, you shouldn't have, because you're the lucky ones who've got in nice and early. Well done for that. But if you do have any problems, we are also simulcasting this on YouTube. So it's live on YouTube as well, in order that others can access it if necessary. And there was a link provided in your joining instructions that came out an hour or so ago. But we are already up to 80 participants, so I'm expecting that we'll have pretty much a full house this afternoon. For those of you who have not been to one of these webinars before, very warm welcome if it's your first time with us. What we have tried to do, and we set ourselves to do as a team at Agilysys several weeks ago, was when we were hitting the point that many of you will no doubt be experiencing of being forced to work from home and feeling a little bit dislocated from colleagues, feeling a little bit disjointed as a sector because there aren't the normal face-to-face meetings, opportunities to gather together. We decided to take a look at what we could do to support and serve the industry that we've been part of for many years. And our conclusion was, why don't we run a bunch of webinars? So we've been running more or less daily on weekdays for the last 4 weeks or so now, and we've still got another couple of weeks worth of planned webinars upcoming. So thank you very much for those of you who have joined us for more than one webinar. We ought to provide you with like badges or something to thank you and express our appreciation for the support that you've shown to us. But we've been covering a range of topics. We've been dealing with a strand on strategy and leadership, a strand on technology, sort of technical and analytical aspects of road safety, and then we've got a strand on design and delivery. And this afternoon, we're going to be taking a look at the subject of behaviour change, or as I put it on the slide in front of you, behaviour change and the safe system, or in another way that I like to think of it is one of our pillars is missing. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through the webinar this afternoon. But it's a couple of minutes past 2, so I'm going to jump into our content in just a moment. Just to explain the way that we set these things up. So at the moment, everyone is muted. You have got the opportunity to raise your hand if there's something that I have failed to address properly and you'd like me to go over. Equally, probably the best way for us to engage together is if you use the Q&A panel that's available within Zoom. So you can raise questions. I can see those questions on my screen, and every time I remember to look at the questions, but it means that I can answer those questions, and I'll probably save most of them towards the end of the material. But it's always better when we've got some kind of discussion going on around the topics that we're looking at. So if, as we work through, there are questions that occur to you, please do just ping them into that Q&A box, and I will try and address those suitably. So without further ado, let's jump into our material. Let me just explain the outline for where we're going to go over the course of this webinar this afternoon. Oh, sorry, one other thing I probably should have just said is also we do make the content available after the webinar. So if there's anything that you see in the slides, or if you want to go back and actually look at the video, then we make both video and presentation slides available for 7 days after the webinar. So they're normally up by about 6 o'clock in the evening, and you can access that content from there using the webpage agilysys.co.uk/standing together, which is the page where you will have registered for this. So in terms of outline for our session this afternoon, there are 5 things that I want us to take a look at. So firstly, the strategic imperative for considering behaviour change, why it's important to us, what it is that we really need to attend to. Secondly, I'm going to take a little look at some shifts in our society and science. that are informing the way that we're thinking about behaviour change now. Thirdly, we're going to take a look at building our response. And then we're going to start to look at some tools for change and some accessible approaches that hopefully people will be able to embrace and include within their own work. But I hope you'll indulge me, because I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. And so I'm going to put up a little picture for you. This is a picture of the Gleno Dam, which is in northern Italy, in Bergamo, which some of you will remember was one of the first places anywhere to get locked down because of the COVID-19 outbreak. But this dam was actually proposed for construction right back in the early 20th century, and initial construction began in 1916. And they started to lay the dam's foundations. And they designed it with one particular specification. So they were going to create the dam one way. And then what happened was, as often happens with major infrastructure projects, as you'll be aware, the money started to run out. And so they decided that they would instead switch the design around. And on top of the gravity dam foundation that they had originally established, they decided to build a multiple arch type dam, which is the archways that you can see in the picture that I've put in front of you. Well, actually, construction was nearly complete, and by October of 1923, the lake that sits behind that dam, which my children have swum in, I've paddled in, but I refuse to swim in. This water's too cold. The dam was, the lake was really full. But on the morning of the 1st of December 1923, the dam wall started to crack. And what happened was an estimated 4.5 billion cubic meters of water ran from that reservoir down the hill and into the valley below. This reservoir sits at 1,535 meters. So for comparison, that is taller than the height of Ben Nevis. And the water gushed down into the valley below. And 356 people were killed because of the flow of water. Why do I share that story? I share that story because if you start designing on one, start building according to one design, and then partway through you change the design, don't be surprised if the system starts to fail. And one of the things that I want to address in our session this afternoon is the degree to which I think that human behavior has been part of our safe system design, but because we're not really sure what to do with it, we keep tweaking the design in order to try and mitigate or get around the fact that human behavior is a constituent part of it. And then we end up with a system that doesn't really work the way that we would hope it should. And I'm going to address that in a number of ways as we go through this afternoon. So what's the problem? Well, many of you will be familiar with some of the things. We've addressed these in a number of our webinars that we've done on road safety over the last few weeks. You'll be familiar with the 5 pillars of the UN Decade of Action. So in May 2011, the decade kicked off and really encouraged countries and authorities to focus on building capacity amongst these 5 pillars: road safety management, safer roads and mobility, safer vehicles, safe road users, and post-collision response. So safe road users was there as one of those pillars. But I've sat in a variety of presentations where we've talked about the role of these pillars, or indeed the role of the safe system. So the safe system develops that thinking and places it in a more integrated way and says these 5 constituent aspects of our system are really important if we want it to be safe. But it also builds in aspects around our understanding of human tolerance to crash impacts and also human frailty, and then thinks about some of the levers and mechanisms that we can introduce to address those. But I've sat through a variety of presentations where we've talked about safe system, and we've talked about the 5 pillars. And then when we talk about, so what can we do? The attention immediately turns to, well, let's make the infrastructure better, or let's make vehicles better. And many of the solutions are devoid of that human aspect. So we've got a design for the system that includes safe road use, but we don't really know what to do with it. And so it either comes down to, well, maybe we should do some education, or maybe we should do some enforcement. And what I want to propose through this session this afternoon is that if we want to genuinely think about that systemic approach to road safety, then we have to think about that safe road user segment, and we have to think about it in a more strategic way. And we have to think about it as more than just what can we enforce and what can we educate. And so there are going to be a variety of tools and frameworks and things that we're going to talk about this afternoon that might help us in addressing some of that segment within our safe system approach. I think one of the things that's quite challenging to us, actually, and if I can be provocative, moment, is to think about actually the nature of the system. So we talk about the safe system in a road safety context. We think, and we as an organization, we advocate for it. Some of you might have taken part in Richard Owen's session specifically on the safe system. So it's not that we don't agree with aspects of this approach, but systems are social constructs. They are things that we imagine and we put structures to, that ways of analyzing and viewing things that exist in the world around us. And Steve Shorrock, who I'll come on to a little bit later as a human factor specialist, writes on systems thinking. Systems have a purpose which can be seen in what the system does. And I just want you to think about our road network for a minute. What is the purpose of our system? Because actually the purpose is not safety. The purpose is mobility. There are a number of associated purposes that we might identify with our road network, such as to facilitate social integration or to facilitate economic growth or the distribution of goods. But at its heart, our system is about mobility. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to fit a value of safety into that system. And we need to think about the ways in which we can fit safety throughout that system. And we're particularly going to be thinking about how we might fit safety around the users of that system as we talk about behavior change this afternoon. So what are some of the things that are changing within society and also science as we think about behavior change? Now, a couple of years ago, I was involved in running an event for Highways England, where we were thinking about behavior change. We called it the Road User Behavior Symposium, and brought together a range of academics, researchers, practitioners, research commissioners, highway authorities to think about what we need to really do to embrace more behavioral approaches into the way in which we design, manage, build our road networks, and also consider the safety of the users of the system. And in fact, I think we might even have a couple of people who were in that webinar, in that seminar on the webinar this afternoon. And myself and Nicola Christie and Simon Christmas wrote a authored think piece at the end of that, and I really have to commend Simon's work on that. He did a significant chunk of the heavy lifting in writing that report. But within it, we identified a number of the things that are changing, and both in terms of our thinking about society, but also our thinking about the science of behavior. So if we think about society as a whole, there are a number of macro social trends that are influencing the way in which people use the network. So these are some of them. We're trying to move away from carbon-based transport. So thinking about electrification, but also significant investment in trying to encourage active and sustainable modes. Working patterns are changing. Just 6% of the population, I was going to say, well, so my notes say 6% of the population work a 9 to 5. That was until, of course, the situation that we all find ourselves in now, where I don't know what your working hours look like. I sometimes find myself at my desk at 7:30 in the morning. Sometimes I find myself at my desk at 10 o'clock at night because my desk happens to be in my home and it's just therefore, there the laptop's on. So, working patterns have been disrupted. They have been being disrupted for a number of years. and they are going to continue to be, especially as we deal with the impact and effects of the kind of situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. Many of you will also have been more reliant on home deliveries over the last few weeks, I'm sure, and that's been one of those mega trends within road network use, is that we are tending to rely more on home delivery services, the Amazon effect, if you like. And then, of course, coming down the line, the sort of the juggernaut that we're all seeing emerging is the use of connected and autonomous vehicles, and what's that going to do in terms of our own road use. And then the big thing from a kind of socio-demographic point of view, aging population as well. So that's going to create shifts in mobility, and not necessarily changing the number of road users that are there, but changing the mix of road use, changing the purpose of their road use. And those are things that we have to be willing to embrace if we're going to ensure the safety of the system. But there are also changes in the science in terms of how we think about behaviour. So behaviour change as a term, or behavioural science, those are terms that have really grown substantially over recent years, particularly the last sort of 30 to 40 years, as we've understood more about neuroscience, and as social scientists have also engaged with a range of particularly sort of public policy issues, and understood that there are different ways in which people respond to the kinds of triggers and cues within our society, within our culture, within our physical context. And so there are a number of things that we pointed to in that think piece, which is available online. You've just got to go to roadsafetyinsight.com and you can download this document. But an understanding that some of our behaviour is more automatic. So we have often treated behaviour as something which is planned, and that's why we lean on education, because we think, well, if we can educate somebody to behave in a certain way, then that's the outcome that we'll get. But actually, so much of our behaviour is programmed by habit and experience. So we do things because we're in the habit of doing them, or because it worked successfully for us previously, or because we've observed other people doing it. Sort of brings us onto the social aspect. As social beings, we make all sorts of judgments about road use based on our subjective norms. So what we see other road users doing, or maybe our prototype. So what we regard as being idealized behavior on that network. We operate much more like herd than we do individuals. So there's a very much a social dynamic to the way in which we behave. We also behave in a very contextualized way. So we take cues from the context around us. That might mean that, for instance, we look at the roads network and we think, well, what speed is this? It looks like it's probably national speed limit. We might have missed some of the other cues that are there, and we may have failed to realize that actually it's a reduced limit to that. And likewise, we also seeing far greater sort of networking in our behavior. We're increasingly connected to other road users, maybe taking cues from them. That may be to do with vehicle information that we're receiving about traffic flows and that sort of thing. It might be that we are picking up cues from our other wider social networks, and those are informing the decisions that we make. So it's a complex field, and I think we're having to understand more and more about the nature of that complexity of human behavior, and then to find ways in which we can engage with people in addressing their needs in that context. So I don't know how you would characterize the way in which you as your organization, or your experience of working in road safety, seeks to approach human behavior within the safe system. But I'm going to throw out a quick poll for you. This is based on a paper from Stephen Shorrock that I mentioned him previously, that I was introduced to by Claire Williams-Atkins. And he talks about 4 kinds of human factors. And as I talk through those briefly, I'm going to launch a little poll for you, because it's always better if we have some interaction, isn't it, rather than me just sitting here talking. And going to ask what your what you would regard as the prevailing approach to behavior in the SAFE system is. Which of these four would you describe it as? So I'm going to launch that poll, gives you an opportunity to participate in that. So type 1 is simplistic and negative. People are a source of trouble. They are the unreliable bit of the system. They are the reason the system breaks. They are why it fails. And the temptation there would be to try and therefore exclude people from the system. We look for the solutions where we have got control. And I think that's one of the things that we've risked doing. Type 2 is the capabilities and limitations of people, their performance and their error types are taken into account. So we regard people and their faults, but we try and sort of avoid those. But we're still very much centered on the human being the reason that the system fails. Type 3 takes us into sort of digesting the external factors such as organization and environment, as well as the internal factors such as cognition and physical condition and emotion that might affect performance. So we see humans and we see and understand some of their frailties. So therefore we try and mitigate for that in the way in which we manage the system. So we perhaps put in more defensive measures. And the fourth type of approach that Shorrock identifies is designing interactions between people and system elements to optimize system performance and human well-being. So this is the F's at the bottom, they're mine because I love to alliterate stuff. So this is my idea of flourishing. What does a system look like where we think about human flourishing in that context? Have we optimized the system so that we are really genuinely building in order to maximize the value for people and for their well-being within that system? So in which case it comes down to design. We're designing the system with in a human-centered way and thinking about the needs, the aspirations, the ambitions of the people who are part of that system, and thinking about the environmental and organizational factors that might influence their behavior, and thinking about the ways in which they might choose to respond within that maybe that physical context. And so we're designing in order to accommodate for them. So there's four types. About half of the people have responded in the poll so far. So keep your votes coming in on that. And it's surprisingly evenly split at the moment, actually, between those four. So we'll just give another couple of minutes for people to respond to that. And then I'll feed back on what we've got in terms of responses there. So whilst you're just some of you just taking the opportunity to consider that and consider what things look like in your world, let me just move on and say, so therefore how should we respond? What are some of the things that we can be doing to think about the system in a way that really identifies that need to focus on safe road use, but recognizing some of those changes that are happening within the society that we operate in. Actually, before I move into that, I'm going to end polling there with about 3/4 of people having had a go and offered a view. And the leading response, hopefully you can see that on your screen now as I share the poll results, is that 32% of people think that we're in that sort of mitigate phase. We're addressing internal and external factors. We are thinking about the human in the system, but we are also thinking about the organizational and environmental factors that come to bear on them. 28% of people think that we're genuinely designing for optimal performance and well-being. And some of you are less optimistic, 40% of you less optimistic than that. But I think that's really interesting, the spread of views from people who were on this webinar this afternoon that go really from regarding humans very much as the unreliable bit and the bit that causes the system to fail, right through to designing in a way that is optimized around human desires and aspirations as well as performance. So let me just move that one, stop sharing those results. So yeah, so how should we respond? Well, one thing that I think is an interesting challenge to us, and this is a sort of throw out there sort of comment really, is a question about, does the answer lie in culture? And I've had conversations with a number of people in a variety of contexts recently about the importance of culture to traffic safety. And actually, I was introduced to, this is Hudson's model of safety culture that I was introduced to by Nicola Christie, and it sort of follows this path where you become increasingly informed, and there's an increasing amount of trust within your culture to ensure that people are behaving in a safe way. And she sort of threw this out, what does it look like to get generative safety culture into our road network, i.e. that safety is the way that we do business around here, rather than what some people might regard as sort of pathological safety culture that we sometimes have, which is who cares as long as you don't get caught. From work that's been done on driver psychology, driver attitudes, we know that there are still a chunk of drivers, probably around about 14%, when focus on speeding, for whom that's the attitude. As long as I don't get caught, I don't really care. What does it take to get us to move that culture? And having had a conversation with a number of people about that, I was directed to this traffic safety culture primer that's been put out by one of the American universities, and I've included a link to it there. I think it's a bit limited because I think it focuses an awful lot on beliefs as a fundamental building block of culture. And I think culture is developed out of more than just beliefs. I think we have to recognize that culture includes issues around value and identity, as well as the way in which culture is expressed, which is around sort of symbolism and our behaviors as well. So at the moment, I think some of that thinking is a bit limited, but I think there's nonetheless a very important question that we should be grappling with about what does our culture of road use say about us? Because when you look internationally, you will see that different cultures have different approaches to road use, and that tends to determine or be quite determinative in terms of the safety outcomes of those systems. Even if they've got very different management systems in place, they're still getting quite similar results. So you take a look at the sun countries, Sweden, UK and the Netherlands, and actually, one's had Vision Zero, one's had sustainable safety, and the UK has not had a safe system approach until it's sort of materialized in some of the government documentation back from about 2015. And yet our performance is incredibly similar. That probably tells you something a bit about the culture and the way in which we respond to legislative instruments, and the way in which we behave normatively and those sorts of things. And I think there's probably much more that we need to understand about culture. But actually, as we start to think about changing behaviour, we want to start to drive towards developing programs, interventions that are really driven by the data and the evidence. So we're delivering the right interventions, the things that actually will work demonstrably, evidentially, empirically work. We need to deliver them in the right place. So we have thought through the mechanisms of delivery that are appropriate to the challenges that we're seeking to address, and that we're targeting them at the right people. And many of you will know that myself and colleagues, one of the reasons that we came together as a team was because a dozen or so years ago, might be a bit more than that actually, just sort of 14 years ago, we started playing with social demographic data and trying to drive insight around what are the road safety issues and how do they change according to the profile of different communities, and started using things like mosaic data to be able to drill into that. So yeah, we're looking to deliver interventions that conform to these tests. Now, that actually creates a very complex network for us. And when I was thinking about this whole thing about, sort of one of our pillars is missing, what ways in which we could engage more effectively and more strategically with behaviour change, I started to do a bit of an exercise mapping out a number of the sort of known behaviour change techniques and thinking about how they could be applied to different road user groups, and how they could also be applied to different actors within the system. You'll notice that I got myself into a little bit of a mess. So I'll let you take a look at this slide at your own leisure if you like, but just to sort of say a bit about it for a moment. So what I've done here is I've put a whole number of road user groups across the top. And when I talk to road safety professionals, we have a terribly difficult task, because actually these groups are distinct, they are different, they are not uniform either in the challenges that they face, or the behaviours that we're trying to address, or the mechanisms through which we address them, or the tools which we might use. And yet often you'll go to speak to a road safety team, or maybe even a lone road safety officer in a local authority, and you say to them, what are you working on? They say, well, I'm trying to do child pedestrian training, I'm trying to do child cycle training, I'm trying to do adult cycle training, I'm trying to do something for powered two-wheelers, I'm trying to do something for young drivers, I'm trying to do older drivers, I'm trying to do ridden horses, and they've got all of these road user groups. What are some of the tools or some of the mechanisms, the behavior change processes that you might be trying to use to reach them? Or you might be doing things like trying to educate or enforce or plan for them or persuade or provide training or enablement. And then at the bottom, these are just some of the actors in the system. So, which bits of this could actually be done by national government or the Strategic Road Authority, which could be done by the blue light services, and which can be done by civil society. And just trying to think through the ways in which actually this is a very complicated thing that we're trying to address if we want to get really effective behaviour change working across the safe system for the value of all road users. If that slide's giving you a headache, I'll move on fairly quickly. And I think one of the other things that we need to consider, and we have begun to consider much more effectively in certain settings over recent years, is and who designs and who delivers. Because if we're going to develop and deliver interventions that work, increasingly what we have identified within from exemplar projects is that all of the skills for doing that don't necessarily sit in one person. So when I first started in road safety quite a long time ago, I was commissioner, designer, and deliverer. I came up with an idea, I designed the idea, I delivered the idea, maybe even did some evaluation of that idea, all in one, sort of one person. It may just be that I'm getting a bit older and wiser, or my brain's a little bit more adult nowadays, but I've definitely come to the conclusion that I can't do all of these tasks. I still like to think I can dabble in bits of them, but to develop stuff that is really genuinely robust requires interaction and engagement from a multidisciplinary team, and that interdisciplinarity is really important if we're going to build reliable, scalable behavior change interventions. So I'm just going to launch another poll for you now. This is one on roles. And so basically what I've done is just say, I've put these roles, commissioners, researchers, translators, etc., into a list for you. And you can multiple choice on this one. So this is different to the last one. So you might just do intervention delivery, but it might be that you feel like you're both commissioner and designer. It might be that you are both commissioning and researching. So you get to play, and if you are a genuine superhero, you can tick all 6 of those. Or if you just feel like you'll run ragged because your bosses expect you to be all 6, then tick all 6 for those as well. But I think, and some of my thinking on this has definitely been shaped by conversations I've had with colleagues across our sector who have either struggled with this or recognized the challenges of some of this. And so I think we've got Jeremy Phillips with us this afternoon, and my inclusion of commissioners in here was particularly because of conversations I had with him about needing to recognize the role of an intelligent client who understands what kinds of services they are trying to commission and they're trying to procure, because it's not like we're buying a sort of a shiny thing. We're not buying chocolate bars. We're trying to invest in programs that will deliver change in human behavior. and there are no guarantees, and therefore there is necessarily going to be a research element within that, and therefore we need to work with researchers in the system. One of the roles that I think we try and perform sometimes is the role of translation. So we're trying to help people to take the wealth of scientific literature and digest it in a way that informs the roles that they are engaged with. Some of you will be involved in design for sure, but really thinking about the mix of skills that you need for design, because it might be people who understand the education environment and training and skills development. It might be people who understand branding and marketing and advertising. It may be people who understand social media and online and how to secure engagement in that. So actually in that design process, that's not just one skill set. There's a whole range of skill sets that are included there. And then who does the delivery of that? And making sure that evaluation is included too. Great. So on the call this afternoon, on the webinar, we've got a real mix coming in of the sort of 70% of you or so who've responded so far. So let me I'm going to end polling there and share the results. Sorry if you didn't quite get in, but actually most people, the largest number put themselves in the research block. Just less than half as commissioners, a quarter doing the translation piece, and then around about, or just over half on the webinar this afternoon, describing that they're doing a mixture of design, delivery and evaluation work as well. It's really interesting to see the sort of breadth of roles that we've got expressed in our audience this afternoon. Let me just stop sharing those results. Okay, so having talked quite a lot about sort of the context, some of the challenges, some of the responses, what then are some of the tools for change that we might want to consider? And I'm going to go through a few of these quite briefly, but if you're interested in particularly this sort of design and design aspect of this, and just sort of give a nod to some other webinars that we've got coming up. So on Monday, Tanya Fosdick and I are going to be doing one specifically on intervention design. And then next Wednesday, myself and Steve Ferris are going to be doing one on digital tools for young drivers. And in both of those, we're going to be using examples of programs that we have designed, developed and run with some measure of success. At least they've won some awards and things. So the Ride Free program that we worked with Highways England and the Eastern region on through last year, and Drive Start is something that we worked with Safer Roads Berkshire to develop. Going to think about some of the ways in which we've utilised some of the approaches I'm going to talk about in building those, and we'll go in a bit more detail to some of them. But let's just talk about some of those that we have been using. Some of the frameworks that I think you will find are helpful. So some of you will be aware of the behaviour change wheel and a sort of psychological model called COM-B. It's probably one of the simplest out there, and basically contends that there are three key things that work in tandem to influence our behavior. That is our capability, and our capability is both our psychological capability and our physical capability, whether we are able to perform a behavior. There's also our motivation, and that is both automatic and reflective. So whether we sort of respond to things automatically and instantly, or whether actually we have processed and reflectively considered the behaviors that we are engaging in. And then the third aspect is opportunity. Do we have the opportunity to be able to behave in a certain way? That's physical opportunity and also social opportunity. So at the moment, I don't have an awful lot of physical opportunity to speed because I never get out of my house. Am I afforded the physical opportunity, the access to the network to be able to do that? Do I have the social opportunity to behave in certain ways? And the interaction of those things informs and reflects our behavior. There are many much more complex models, some that are much more focused on particular behaviors or particular parts of the population. But it's definitely a good model to get you thinking about the behavior of people that you're looking to engage with and how we might change that behavior by influencing those aspects. And what the behavior change wheel then does is think about that COM-B at the center, capability, opportunity, and motivation, and then thinks about some of the categories of or some of the mechanisms for change that can be put around that. So if people don't have the capability, can we provide them with training so that they do have the capability, the skills to be able to do the thing that you want them to do? If people have the automatic motivation, how can we help to change that by getting them to be perhaps more reflective of their behavior through regulation or guidelines or even coercion? So the behavior change wheel, and there's a book to go with it, you can find it online, takes you in a sort of step-by-step process to be able to engage with that. One of the things that has been advocated for a number of years is the use of behavior change techniques as well in terms of our intervention design. Now, I've only put a few of them up here because I haven't got time to go through behavior change techniques in a sort of, all of them. There are, I think, 27 that are identified in Fiona Filan's guide that I've taken a snippet from here, but that's a fantastic resource, and I would highly recommend, if you've not used it before, Guidance for the Road Safety Community using behavior change techniques, published by the RAC Foundation and written by Fiona Filan in 2017, an excellent document. But gets you to think about what are some of the active ingredients that we can put into our interventions that will help to shift behavior. So those are some of the things, that some of the sort of frameworks and tools that we can use. How do we put those together in something of a design process? And so one of the processes that we have adopted over the last few years is double diamond process, which was originally pulled together by the Design Council. And what the double diamond process sort of takes you through is these sort of two segments, or four segments really. Firstly, there's a section called Discover. So it's about finding out the root of your problem. And what we do there is we do a needs analysis. We look to really dig into what the road casualty data is telling us, or what the academic research is telling us. We would also use like mosaic analysis in order to drive our insights into the communities that we're identifying from the data are most at risk, so that we can understand as much as we can about that. And then from that, we drive through a process where we sort of bring all of that, sort of great depth of data, and we try and hone it into a defined problem through a process of behavioral insight. So we use things like segmentation and designing personas, so that we've got a realistic handle on something that we can work with in terms of designing the intervention. Then from there, we sort of throw the net wide again in this development phase, where we're thinking about what are the behavioral processes. So we use COM-B, we use the intervention functions from the behavior change wheel, and we use the behavior change techniques. We think, what are the things that we can throw at this problem that will enable us to find ways of thinking? And again, the reason it goes wide is because we're trying not to rule anything out at this point. We're trying to make sure that we've captured the breadth of buttons that we can press and levers that we can pull in order to find ways of addressing the behavioral challenge that we are grappling with. And then what we do is we bring that together. So we've got another converging path into the delivery phase. So we come up with a solution which is we think is well designed, that's got a logic model behind it. So we've got a process that explains how we think this will work and change behavior. And we've got a framework for a pilot program that is then deliverable. And we've got an evaluation framework that will allow us to be able to test it and see how robust it is. And so if you're looking for a kind of a process that will help you to kind of get through a behavior change, finding a solution to a behavioral challenge, then we found this to be quite useful as a tool for doing so. And so I then just want to sort of finish off with some accessible approaches. So what I've just explained, I mean, using things like the behavior change wheel and behavior change techniques, or going through that whole double diamond process, might fill you with a sense of sort of trepidation. You might think, well, that sounds like quite a big thing. So what I wanted to do was finish off with some really kind of accessible ways in which we can think about what we can put into our programs or our projects, or what interventions we might already have going that are cognizant of human behavior as we're trying to address it, and maybe some slightly sort of simpler tools and approaches as we go through. Just pause there. Anna's asked a question, can we find documentation online? What I have tried to do as I've gone through here, you should notice that most things have got footnotes in the slides. So if you download the slides, there are either hyperlinks to the content that I'm talking about, or most of it is accessible and locatable online. So please, I would encourage you, go and engage with some of this stuff and find it. It is readily accessible. I'm kind of bringing it together and hopefully giving you a sort of distillation of some of it. Let me take you into some accessible approaches. So a decade or so ago, I co-wrote an article with Alan Tapp, who I think is with us on the webinar this afternoon. Quite what he's doing, spending time listening to me. I don't really know. Those of you who don't know Alan, he's Professor of Social Marketing at the University of Western England. And we ended up co-writing an article about what has social marketing got to bring to the world of road safety. And I introduced this idea of a social marketing matrix. I come from a marketing background, and so we tend to think as marketeers, without my background, about things like the 4 Ps of price and promotion and all of that sort of stuff that I ought to remember very much more readily off the top of my head. And what we were thinking is, how can we get people to think about the behavioural challenges that people are facing, and what might be the sort of appropriate ways to direct them to intervene. And so what this matrix does is kind of say, okay, with any behavior that we're looking for people to change, there is a personal cost. That personal cost might be incredibly small, or that personal cost might seem incredibly high. If it's something like giving up smoking, that's a high personal cost. It's so entrenched in people's lifestyle and approaches that actually it's a big demand there. But there are other things that are low cost. Putting on your seatbelt, for instance, most people do not consider that to be of high personal cost. But then there are other things. The other aspect of this, the other sort of dimension is, and what benefit do people feel that they achieve? So if they feel a tangible benefit, i.e. it makes them feel more secure, it makes them feel better about themselves, it makes them feel like they're a better driver, then those are tangible benefits. Well, there might be some really intangible benefits. So actually things like maybe recycling, or long-term health benefits. This will add 3 months to your life expectancy. Well, that's a long way down the road. I mean, especially if you're a 17, 18-year-old driver. So thinking about both the costs and benefits to the individual will then inform ways in which we think we might have to engage with them. So if it's extremely low cost and the benefits are tangible, well, then all you need to do is draw people's attention to it, and they will probably engage with that behavior. Whereas if the cost is high and the benefits are intangible, and often that's what we're dealing with public health issues, is that we're asking you to eat 5 a day and do so many blocks of exercise and not smoke and not drink and do these things, and in the hope that it will add some benefit to you somewhere later down the line. That's quite an intangible benefit for a lot of people, and therefore those might be issues where we need to exercise some control rather than just communicate. And then in around those, if people feel the benefit, they know that there's a benefit, but they also recognize that there's a cost. We need to help them and support them. We need to provide care around them. If it's intangible but low cost, then we just make it convenient. If it's convenient for them to do it, then actually we found this is the sort of nudging can get them to behave in a certain way. Okay, I'm fairly close to an end. You'll be glad to know. Another model that we found quite useful. Sorry, I've skipped over one. East, this was put together by the Behavioural Insights team when they were in the Cabinet Office. And what they advocate for is making things easy, attractive, social and timely. East, yes, I did do it in the right order. So just some examples of that, making things easy. My son, who is just turned 16, got a check in the post the other day, and he was just like, what do I do with the check? Because he's 16. Internet banking has now made checks payable in online. They've made something easy in order to allow us to engage with that bit of the banking system, and especially good in a time where we're locked down, where you can't get into branches. Make it attractive. Here's an idea. I mean, we've seen other examples. Get people to put things in the bin by making it attractive to play a game even as you put things in the bin. Make it social. If people are engaging in things where they need that social support, like maintaining exercise routines or losing weight or other things, are there ways in which we can engage them socially? So building social networks around that. I've just used Strava here, but there are other examples as well. And make it timely. So I imagine most people have been through an airport or somewhere and seen these push buttons, were you happy with your experience today? Dead easy and a timely way, it's salient. People are thinking about their experience that they've just had, allows them to respond in a timely way to that. So East, we can apply to the things that we're thinking of doing. Are there ways that we can make things easier or more timely for people? Can we introduce a more social dynamic? That's a great framework that you can use. And the final one, and this is the ISM framework developed by Andrew Darnton and Dave Evans, that was put together for the Scottish government, and gets you to think through the domains in which you want to sort of shift behavior. Is it around the individual, the social, or the material? I've used it in running sort of workshops and thinking about particular points of behavior. Where are people behaving? How are they behaving? And then getting participants to think about what are the things that we could do around that. Are there things that we could do to change the physical infrastructure where they are? Or are there ways in which we could embrace sort of some of the social networks around people in order to influence behavior? Or have we got to really work with the individuals in order to think about their own sense of agency or their own habits in order to inform that behavior? So there's some good frameworks around, and I have included links to those. So please go away and think about those. I just want to say, either I'm, I haven't had many questions in, so if you've got any questions, please do get those in. I'll come to those in a moment as well. So it'd be great to have any questions that you've got. And I just wanted to finish with a couple of final comments, really. Firstly, please do evaluate and share. This is one of the big things that we have laboured as an organisation over many years, is the value of evaluation, not only the things that work, but also the things that don't. And some of you may have participated in the evaluation workshop that Tanya Fosdick and Aman Kaur hosted last week, I think it was. That's still available on the website, although I think it's only got about a day to go before it will disappear. So if you're interested in the content of their evaluation workshop, please go there. You can download all of the resources. And also, just to say, there's further content available. So here's a couple of websites. I mentioned roadsafetyinsight.com, which is a little microsite that we built around the Road User Behaviour Symposium that we ran with Highways England and the Paving the Way report. And there's an e-learning module on there. And there's also all of the presentations from that conference are available to view from there. So that's worth visiting. And the second one, roadsafetyanalysis.info, is, again, it's a little microsite that I knocked together because myself and a couple of other colleagues were delivering some training for the Global Alliance of NGOs for Road Safety, and both their global conferences in Kuala Lumpur and Chania in Greece over the last few years. And so what we did is we populated all of our content from those training sessions on there, and there's loads of links on there. So any of the links that I've mentioned are almost certainly in the further reading section of that website as well. So please do go and take a look at those. I haven't got any questions. So I don't know whether the question thing is not working or whether I've just gone on too long. I would hope that it was suitably interesting. If anyone wants to fire in a question, it'd be great to hear from you, and I'll happily take them live now. Or you can drop me a line, and my details are in the final slide of this presentation. They will be available for you to download, as I say, from later on this evening. Some questions. Thank you. Question from Vicky. We always have that extremely hard to reach group that we generally have to resort to enforcement for. What model BCT would you advise for those? Yes, good question, Vicky. And I think that's where you do the process of trying to understand who your target audience is and what motivations they might have, and therefore what the appropriate BCTs or intervention categories might be for them. And enforcement is one of the aspects that's there and available to us. You know, sort of legislation and coercion and enforcement are legitimate parts of seeking to change behaviour. When we were doing a Q&A session on Monday talking about the impact of coronavirus on traffic safety, Neil Kinnear was talking about work that TRL had done about speeders, and they'd identified that segment who are very deliberate in their behaviour, and they know what the rules are, and they know that they are flouting them, and they are shameless about it. And in those cases, then it is appropriate for us to utilise enforcement programs in order to address that behavior. And I think there are some really good ones around. I mean, so, you know, not only as you well know, because I know that your great work in the safety camera world, we can see some quite transformative work through enforcement through technology. We're starting to see that through things like OpSnap, utilizing dash cams as well. And it may be that actually, you know, it's not just about capturing the offences, but then also utilising other behaviour change techniques at the back end of that. So things like alcohol interlocks for people who've been caught drink driving. I would love for there to be some sort of exploration of greater use of things like telematics as a rehabilitative tool for things like speeding. So I think when we think about some of those challenging behaviours, we do need to think about enforcement, but not only about how we capture the offences, but also about how we might sustain and maintain changed behaviour over a longer term. That's a great question. Sorry, just having a quick oh, great. Okay, so Vicky just saying that OpSnap is something that they found success with, so glad that it's been mentioned. So good work there. A comment from Alan Tapp. I'm going to read it live. I hope that's good, Alan. There's a big job on, I think, to reconcile your earlier comments on road safety as a system, which implies holistic ecological thinking, with later material on BCTs, behaviour change will, etc., which are reductionist in nature. They split out behaviours into bite-sized cause and effect and offer single discipline solutions. We could spend some interesting time trying. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the thinking that goes on around, you know, sort of systems thinking, is rails against being reductionist and saying, well, actually, if you're going to think about the system, stop trying to break it down to its smallest parts, its smallest constituent parts. That is reductionist. And I think there's a real challenge if we're going to develop appropriate interventions to maintain a view of the system, but also to address particular behaviours or behaviour in particular groups. And I think what I've tried to do is to maintain some breadth and say, well, look, we need a system that works. How do we get a system that works? Well, that leads us to think about developing and designing interventions that require us to do a certain amount of breaking down that behaviour. So yeah, I think there is a bit of reductionism in what I'm suggesting, but I think what I've tried to do is put it in a much more holistic context and say it's not just about the solutions. It's about trying to find things that work as we deliver a system that works for all. So yeah, that's a really interesting challenge. Okay. I'm going to take this question from Jacqueline. Research with drivers tends to find most think they're better than average in skill, safety, etc. Do you have any thoughts about helping people see the need for behaviour change in the first place? Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think some of what we have done with younger drivers in some of the programs that we've run is about trying to break down some of their preconceptions about their own levels of skill and competence. So actually we've used things like games which challenge them to maintain cognitive function on two tasks simultaneously. So, you know, people say, well, I can talk on the mobile phone and drive perfectly safely. But actually, you know, you demonstrate for them how they are basically cognitively overloaded if you give them you start them on one task and then you give them another task, and you demonstrate to them the ways in which they are incapable of doing those things. So I think there are tools and techniques that we have sought to develop into some of the interventions that we've worked with that help to break down that confidence. The other thing we can talk about is normative behavior. So you know, they might think that they are very skillful, but if we can say to them, well, actually, for 95% of the driving population, they would have a problem with doing this. So we get them to challenge some of their own thinking, because I think some of the things that we have done historically, and we've seen this in programs I've been involved with in the past, is we present them with the bad behaviors as being normative. You know, so we spend all of this time talking about drink driving or mobile phone use or not wearing your seatbelts. And at the end of it, they go away thinking, well, obviously everyone drinks and drives, everyone uses their mobile phone whilst driving, and nobody wears their seatbelts. So actually we have to be very careful that we don't reinforce negative behaviors. So thinking about normative behavior, and particularly we found some success if we get them to think about what their family would regard as safe or what their friends would regard as safe. So we set the challenge for them to think about what's normative amongst their own social circle, and we therefore use sort of social pressure to help them to consider their own behaviour. So there's a couple of things that we've certainly utilised there. Okay, question, can you suggest to me any topic to work on, self-project on safety during this pandemic? Well, I've given you lots of stuff to go and work on. So if you want to go and take away some of this, please do. All of the information from our webinar on Monday about the effect of coronavirus and lockdown on traffic and transport safety is available on our website. So go to agilysys.co.uk/standing together, and you can access that if you want some more. Okay, I think I've dealt with the questions that have come in. I've definitely slightly overstayed my welcome and just gone beyond the hour, but thank you very much for those of you who stayed with us throughout. Really appreciate your time, your attendance, and thank you for being with us. As I've already mentioned, there are other webinars coming. Links for those are on our website, and all of the resources from today will be available later on this evening. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, stay safe out there, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.